This proudly cosmopolitan city has a population which speaks more than 200 languages. It is known as Canada's downtown, and it's got one really big tower. It is time to get curious about Toronto.
Here's what I'm curious about in Toronto. Who built a 98-room European fairy tale castle in Canada? And what do streetlights have to do with it? What does a windmill have to do with a Canadian empire? Where can you find secret underground tunnels in Toronto? Why is this shop and this synagogue so important to Toronto's history? When did hockey become a Canadian obsession? And what does this bank have to do with it? And how did Toronto get its name? And seriously, what's the correct way to say it? Who, what, where, why, when, and how. So much to be curious about in Toronto. Toronto was first home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Europeans first arrived in the 17th century, partly because of the lucrative fur trade. That is why, to this day, you will see a beaver on the city crest of Toronto. Then, Toronto becomes part of the British colonies. For markers of those days, simply look up at the street signs. There's Yonge Street for the 18th century British Secretary of War, and Simcoe Street for British Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. And he was kind of important because he chose the location for the capital of Upper Canada and named it Toronto. Or did he?
Here is the famous Toronto sign here in downtown, of course on top of an ice skating rink. The name Toronto is believed to come from the First Nations phrase for where you find trees and water. But did you know that Toronto wasn't always named Toronto? In fact, for a while there, it was called York. But as we all know, New York had kind of staked claim to that name long before. So here's the curious history of how Toronto became Toronto.
So yes, Simcoe did name Toronto Toronto at first, but then a few years later he renamed it York. Why? Well, for the Duke of York and basically to make the city more British.
Hello.
That's why today we have the neighborhood of Yorkville in Toronto and the York Rose on that Toronto coat of arms. But there was a teeny tiny problem. There was this place in America called New York, and it was kind of a big deal. So by comparison, the York here in Canada started to be called Little York, and worse still, Muddy York, and nobody liked that. So the original name of Toronto was restored in 1834 and has been thus ever since. But there's one more thing. A surefire way to let on that you're a tourist is to say Toronto. Locals say Toronto. They don't pronounce that second T. You can even get that pronunciation on a T-shirt.